Good morning and welcome back to commsHRO. We're on session 2 of day 3 and we've just heard an amazing session on sustainable marketing strategy. So definitely check that out if you weren't able to make that session. And this session we'll be hearing from Farzana Baduel about being a non-executive director. So that's going to be a fascinating session and one with lots of interaction. We hope so. Please do ask your questions. We've got the Q&A tab at the top, and we also have the chat function, so you can put your comments in there so we can hear what your thoughts are through the session. And don't forget to use the emoji button to show your love and appreciation as well. So before I introduce Farzana, just to remind you to share your posts on socials using the hashtag commsHRO, and we will be announcing 6 prize draw winners at the end of today. So if you haven't posted already, please do that so that you're in with a chance to win some fantastic prizes. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Farzana. And Farzana is a passionate advocate for strategic communications, and she is the co-founder and CEO of Curzon PR. And she'll be speaking today about getting into boardrooms and being a non-executive director. So really interested in what Farzana has to speak about today. So please give it up for Farzana.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so first of all, there's no need to sort of take notes or anything like that, because I've written an article that has all this information in it, and happy to share it afterwards for those who want to follow up on any of the items that I discussed. So what I wanted to go through today is basically why become an ED. NED is an acronym for non-executive director. So I wanted to cover why, and then I wanted to cover how, and then I wanted to cover what you do when you get there. So we've only got half an hour. Please, if you've got any questions, pop it in the question chat, and I will either answer them during the session or I'll answer them at the 5 minutes that we've got at the end. And I'll get started. So I'd say why? Like, why would you want to? I mean, everyone's super busy. You're juggling, work, family, health. Why do you want to take on an extra, a piece of work? So I think the positive thing about becoming a non-executive director is that it opens your world to a new tribe of people, a new world. So for instance, those of us who are working in the sort of, corporate sector, if we always sort of feel a sense of, we want to do some work in charity, but, we can't actually work in a charity. For instance, if you become a trustee of a charity, it gives you that sort of, that access to working with charities, but not giving up your day job. So that's like one example. Another good reason why to become a non-executive director, it actually improves your skill set. I have a day job where, my focus is to run a business, and actually you're constantly thinking about sort of, short-term goals and firefighting and things like that. And actually when you sit on a board, it's a very different skill set. It's much more sort of strategic. It's not executive. It's not tactical. So it kind of uses a different part of your brain, and it allows you to think much more sort of long-term rather than, oh my God, here's my to-do list. Let me just get through it week by week. So it's kind of like, instead of your tactical thinking that you may have to do a lot in your day job, it's much more sort of strategic work. So a very different part of your sort of your brain. The third good reason to do it is it opens up a new world of networks. And, as us PR people, networks are important and they're valuable. What it does, it opens up a whole new world to different people that you wouldn't perhaps come across. All of us often, make a lot of our friends from school, from university, from our workplace, and then it becomes a bit more difficult to make new sort of contacts as we get older. And so actually sitting on sort of boards allow you sort of access to new worlds. And it's always exciting to meet different people because, each person is a sort of, I feel they're sort of a living book that you could learn from. So those are some of the reasons why. The other reasons why is, increasingly people are looking at portfolio careers. People don't sort of have that sort of mono approach to life where it's like one job, from start to finish, and then retire and live, happily ever after. Now we live in a world where actually it's far more acceptable to sort of juggle lots of different things, to perhaps be working freelance somewhere, to be, have some business side hustle on the side. And so actually being on boards is another sort of avenue to add to your portfolio if you're that way inclined, that you just, you want to do a little bit more than just focus on perhaps, a full-time a job that you may have, or part-time. Now, of course, it allows income. So, there is also a, not all NED positions attract income, especially charities tend not to, but there are, obviously positions that you can earn quite well, and you can also have it as a sort of, a nice safeguard for you, perhaps in the future when you're looking to retire, and you want to start building up your NED experience now. So, it's not like immediately you finish working and then you're sort of scrambling around for NED roles. It's something you can build up in order to future-proof your career. So those are the reasons why. Now, what on earth is a NED? I read this really interesting quote, and it said, it's quite a bit crude, and it said, non-executive directors, they're a little bit like B-days. No one quite knows what they do, but they just had that little touch of class. So I thought that was quite funny, because actually I started applying for sort of NED roles and not quite understanding what they were, but I sort of felt, oh, it's something quite aspirational. I want to get involved in that world. Didn't quite understand what that world was. And I started reaching out to people about 10 years ago. And I ended up sort of getting these NED roles about 10 years ago. And I was sitting on these boards, and I didn't quite know what I was doing there. Often I didn't speak up, even when I sort of felt something inside that I need to speak up. And then, of course, somebody else speaks up about the same point 5 minutes later, and everyone's like, yeah, great point. And you sort of kick yourself. So, a lot of sort of imposter syndrome when you go in your first sort of NED roles, thinking, questioning your own value, for instance. And then I recently, actually, after being on sort of boards for about 10 years, I thought, you know what, I just don't feel I'm making much traction or adding value to the board. It was my sort of sense. And I embarked upon a series of courses and research to sort of learn more about the best practice. And there's a number of courses you can go on. You've got the Institute of Directors. They do a really good one-day course. You've got much longer courses with the Financial Times. And of course, there is a lot of information online to read about it. So first of all, how to get a NED role. Now, of course, best practice is organizations, they sort of publish a NED position on their website, on their social media, on their newsletters, perhaps even on platforms like New Role, and in order to sort of really bring in a wide variety of applicants. And the reality is, a lot of what I've seen is that doesn't really happen, or if it does happen, it's probably just a nod to good practice and process. But what often happens is, people who are existing on the board or advisors to the board are like, what, I've got this great person who I think would be great for your board. So it's still also, very much contingent upon network. You do see a lot of sort of like best practice board governance going into actually publishing these roles much more wider and not having this closed shop approach. But the reality is that it's still quite contingent upon network. How can you deal with that when you perhaps don't have that network? So I wasn't born into a network. What I tended to do is I'm naturally quite curious. So I would volunteer for staff left, right, and centre. Somebody asked me to do something, it'd always be yes. I'd think about it later. But these sort of the downside is you get a bit exhausted, but the upside is you get to meet lots of different people. But actually, you've got to be super targeted when it comes to looking for NED roles and looking to leverage your network in order to get one. And the best way, what I've learned in the last 10 years, is actually the best way is to network with other people on the board, because they often hear about opportunities, and often they carry weight when they recommend people for NED roles, and they can also help sort of counsel you in the application and the approach and the board dynamics and things like that. So often when people are sitting on boards, they're the first ones to know when there's vacancies, when there's an outgoing board director, and they're also good to put a good word in for you, and they can kind of leverage their relational capital on the board in order to sort of present you in the right light. So how do you meet these NED roles? I would say that when you come across people and you see that they're sitting on boards, it's really good to actually just say to them, something I'm really interested in. These are the sort of organizations that I'm interested. These are the sort of skill sets that I have. Let me know if you hear anything. So that's one thing that's really quite good to be vocal about. Find out in your network who, and even if it's even if you and I don't know each other, please feel free to reach out to me afterwards on LinkedIn. Because often there's a lot of people who sit on boards and they're very happy to help those people who aren't in NED roles, but kind of need to be sort of steered towards one. So please feel free to reach out to me after this, and I'm always happy to help in whatever capacity I can. Now, often I've reached out to people on LinkedIn who I don't know at all, and half of them people ignore me, the other half don't. I mean, I think at the end of the day, some people don't like being approached if there's no previous sort of relationship, and others actually quite open. And what's the worst that could happen? You get ignored. Now what I did is I actually used to look at organizations that I was curious and interested in, and I would just make a beeline for them, and I would just say, I was quite sort of like straightforward and bullshit, and that kind of reacted. I think it didn't work actually in hindsight, because I was very focused on, I want to be on your board. That's what I want. And I was really thinking about my sort of perspective, and in a very kind of like almost selfish way. And what I realized over time, that you actually have to market yourself to boards almost like you're marketing a product. So you've got to really look at your target audience, i.e. the existing board. You've got to look at the composition of skills on that board. You've got to then look at the organization and look at their strategy. So Google, is there something the CEO said about the strategy, or the executive chair? And then have a look and see, this is their strategy. This is the existing composition of their boards and the skill sets of the relative board members. And actually, this is where I can fit in, and I can help them deliver their strategy, because there's a deficit of the specific skill set that's required to be leveraged in order to reach that strategy for that organization. So I changed my approach from, I want to be on the board because I feel like it and it sounds a bit posh, to actually I understand your organization. I understand the challenges. I understand your strategic priorities. I understand your existing board composition. I understand the skills deficit. And actually that skill deficit, I believe I can plug, because these are, the areas that I would add value. So I think really turning it around into just, doing what PRs do best, really dialing up that empathy, focusing upon what you can give rather than what you can get. So that, and every board position that I've had in the last 10 years represents, tens, if not, God knows how many rejections or ignoring that I've had. So I think, it's really important to be resilient. Don't give up if, you get ignored, you get no. It, sometimes it can be a bit of a numbers game. So not to get sort of upset or disheartened about it. Now, the other thing that I realized, what makes somebody good at, being on the board, or what actual skill sets can you really leverage and improve when you're on the board? And I'd say the two most important things are emotional intelligence and self-awareness. It's actually really interesting. It's not really, it tends to be quite boards differ from organization to organization, but they can be quite politicized, and it isn't a straightforward play. You've got to really build relational capital with other board members. You've got to really build trust, and you've got to have the emotional intelligence and understanding when you bring things up, how you bring things up, the timing, the tone, and also having self-awareness about how you come across. It's very different. When you've got your day job and you're in an executive role, it's just about, getting stuff done. It's about level of competence, sometimes based upon technical ability. When you're on the board, it's a totally different skill set. And emotional intelligence and self-awareness are definitely areas to really develop and be aware of. And that's what makes it so exciting. If, like me, you've got a day job, and and often you do use emotional intelligence and self-awareness in your day job, but when you're on the board, it's a very different area, and you've got to really develop the abilities to convene. So that means, if you want some influence in a certain direction, what's your ability to convene the board in that direction? And sometimes, how do you tackle and face resistance? So it's actually quite fascinating when you really understand the board composition and the organization's strategies and values, and you understand what value you can add. That's the kind of easy part. It's a bit of an analytical piece, and the tricky part is really to understand the organization's culture, from what they say to actually what the reality is, because it may be like, these are values, and the reality is the values are very different. And so you've got to really not only understand the organization's culture, but also what the micro culture of the board is. That's really important. Sometimes you'd assume that the chair of the board will have a lot of clout. Sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes there's another person in the board that actually steers the board. So it's really understanding who's on the board, what sort of culture, which is very difficult to do unless you kind of meet them. And even when you meet them, often people have masks, you don't really know what's behind the scenes, but really just being cognizant and aware of culture, not only of the organization, but the culture of the board, to see whether you're a good cultural fit. Because sometimes you could go on the board, you've got the right skills, you could really deliver value, there's a deficit of those skills on the board, you can really help the organization steer towards its strategic goals, but actually you fall flat because culturally the board doesn't really fit the way that you like to work and operate and communicate. And that's why it's important to have that emotional intelligence and self-awareness. And you can really get that from getting to know various people. In the past, when I've been invited to join a board, I'd say, yeah, definitely, without thinking it through. And actually, in hindsight, what would have been really good would be to say, can I meet separately with different members of the board so you can really understand the different perceptions? And that gives you really good, because, some boards are, I sit on some boards pro bono, and you really want to make sure that you have a good use of your time. You don't want it just sitting there on LinkedIn making your profile look good. You really want to add value, and in order to do that, it's not just about the skills that you bring to the table and the experience. It's also whether you're a cultural fit, because otherwise you could have great ideas and great strategic thinking, but if the culture of the organization, if the board is such, you may not actually add any value, and that becomes a bit depressing over time to sort of sit in these mindless board meetings and you don't feel that you're moving the needle. Now, the other area of actually getting, looking for board positions is there's a really good online platform called New Role. Again, this is in a blog that I'm happy to share with anybody who wants to reach out afterwards. It's called NUROLE. It's a really interesting platform where I think it kind of makes it much more accessible, and it's free for starters. You go in, you log in, you fill out your details, you fill out the skill sets you're interested in, the type of organizations, is it charities you're interested in, or is it commercial only, what sectors? You fill out what you add to the table, maybe comms or marketing. And then what happens is that they send you every week a little list of, here's all the vacancies. And they also make it easy for you to apply, because they remember all of your sort of CV and your bio, and they kind of, you just press a button, and sometimes you've got to fill in a bit of a personal statement. But I find that's been actually really quite good and useful. And, it's wonderful to see organizations using that platform in order to have a more diverse, accessible way of recruiting new NED roles. There's different types of NEDs, and there's lots of jargon that people throw, so you've got to kind of figure that out. So you've got something called independent NEDs, and they're often people who come in from outside the organization, and they bring in tremendous value because they're not bogged down with the internal perspectives and the internal issues and the politicking. They really are sort of external, and they bring that external perspective. You've also got senior independent directors, and they often are they're brought in as a bit of a check and balance to the chair. And you've got investing NEDs, so perhaps private equity, big investors want to put somebody on the board to just make sure that the organization is going aligned, and they're protecting their investment by having somebody that knows what's going on within the organization. You've got nominee NEDs when people are like, well, actually, I can't be on the board myself, but I'm going to nominate this person to be there instead. And then for charities, they often call them trustees. For schools, they often use the term governors. And you've obviously got third sector NEDs as well. So those are the different types of NEDs, and you'll see these words sometimes used interchangeably. And why, and the other reason is why do organizations need NEDs? And it's really to monitor executive activity, and it's to shape strategy. So it puts you in a bit of an awkward position because you've got to call out the executive team sometimes. You've got to say, well, I'm not quite happy with this, or, and a lot of it is about analyzing risk. And you've got to constructively challenge assumptions. And that's really hard to do. For those of you who perhaps like me are a bit conflict avoidant, a bit of a people pleaser, it's a huge challenge to overcome, but it's a wonderful exercise in order to really develop those skills, that you have. So really constructively challenge assumptions, and that's where the emotional intelligence comes in. And how can you facilitate change? By being the sort of trusted counsel, and also the conscience of the organization. Are they doing something unethical, something that doesn't sit quite right? Or is there some greenwashing going on in the organization where they're saying that they're making all these commitments, but the reality is they're not allocating resource to their sort of expressed intentionality. So all of that sort of stuff. So, you're really at the organization, you're the heart and the sort of the mind of the organization. And because you're not doing the day-to-day work, often if you're an independent NED, you've got that perspective and you've got that freedom to do that. What you also do is you take a broader view of the operating environment. So a lot of horizon scanning, again, that's a very good skill for PR people. What is happening in the short term, medium term, long term, not only in terms of threats, but what are the opportunities as well? If somebody was on the border, for those of who are of a similar generation of me, we had Blockbuster Video. Somebody sitting on that board should have been, hold on, there's organizations like Netflix coming, there's a threat, there's like a grey rhino heading towards us. What are we going to do to mitigate that risk? So, when you see organizations that basically, end up with huge sort of challenges that could have been avoided because it was in the pipeline because of some technological progress happening, and the internet speed is increasing, allowing video streaming. That's where the people on the board should have been, oh, we see that coming. What are we going to do about it? And how are we going to mitigate our risk of being made redundant and then going into liquidation? So that is the type of stuff, that's how critical and important a board is, because, the CEO, the C-suite, they're like firefighting, dealing with issues. They just don't have always the ability to have the blue sky thinking. And that's why it's such an important, value add for people, for organizations. The other thing, obviously, is leveraging relationships for the benefit of the organization. Sometimes the organization sits in silos within their sector, and if you come from an outside sector, bringing in those relationships as well as the insight, it's a huge value add. So when you get there, what do you do? Or perhaps even before your interview, probably quite a good idea to read the UK Corporate Guidance Code 2018. Again, this is all in my blog. This also awaits corporate governance principles for large companies, and there's also principles for unlisted companies as well, because you've got different regulated industries. If it happens to be listed, then there's a different sort of lens that the NEDs have to apply in regulated industries, or if they're listed. Sector context matters massively. So if you're applying to go on the board, you need to understand best practice, because just because it may be, you have to sort of give your ideas and your insight within contextual sort of frameworks, and really understanding the industry norms as well. So I think that is super critical. Diversity is not just gender and ethnicity and sexuality, it's cognitive diversity. So the biggest issue about boards is they bring on people in their own image, and not necessarily just thinking about gender and ethnicity, often thinking a lot about sort of cognitive thinking. So I get on with this person because they think like me. Actually, in boards, what you need is people to have that little bit of healthy conflict, have different perspectives, because you cannot have groupthink on a board. And the minute you don't go there, it becomes a very dysfunctional board. If everyone just gets on with each other and everyone agrees and there's no sort of stress testing. So diversity of the board is critical to avoid group thinking. And also, somebody once said to me, well, I'm sort of 25 and, do I have anything to add to the board because I don't have enough experience? And the idea of boards are like, people in their 50s or 60s. That's not true at all. A lot of boards make mistakes, especially if one of their stakeholders or an important stakeholder are sort of Gen Z or millennials. If they don't have somebody on the board to, voice the perspectives of that generation, then they can fall flat in creating a strategy and not understanding what's around the corner in terms of changing cultural mindsets, in the sort of, the new generations entering the workforce. So do not think just because you're 25, you cannot go into boards. You just have to sometimes articulate why you should be on there, because sometimes people on the board may not understand the value of bringing in people from younger generations, because there is like a bit of an outdated view about what a NED person should look like and how much experience they ought to have. And bear in mind that it's all about governance. And if you look at the origin of the word, governance is Latin for steer. So you're like steering the ship. So that's a good way of thinking about it. Google grey rhinos and black swans, because that's also what's really important. What are the things that actually that's heading towards you? Think blockbuster video and online video streaming. And then what are the black swans, the things that you just couldn't have anticipated was going to happen? Those are a bit more difficult, obviously, to find out about. The other issues are when you get there, you've got to stay in your lane, your strategy, not operational. And this one's a bit difficult because when you join a board of perhaps an underfunded charity that doesn't have a wide operational team, they may invite you to, be on their board. But what that may be dressed up as is, yes, you're on our board, but actually, can you knock out the press releases and do all of that? And it's up to you. I mean, the reality is that organizations function differently in terms of what they expect from the board. But the reality is that you need to make that decision, and you need to be really clear about, are they bringing you in as a proper board member in terms of strategy and steering and governance, or are they bringing you in because actually they can't afford a PR person and they just want you to do it pro bono for them, and and what they give back is you're on the board, but actually you're doing what an executive in-house PR person would be, but they don't have the budget for it. So definitely be aware about that, because that happens quite a lot. The other things, if you do get invited on boards, have a look at their D&O insurance, direct and office insurance, because the other thing you need to know about is there's personal liability involved with certain positions. If you're an advisory council, obviously it's very different, but if there is an issue, you could be held to account. You could be hauled to select committees like those trustees of the kids charity when it went into liquidation. So know your personal liability and know if the D&O insurance that they have, read it. If it covers the legal costs, if you're if you're then personally sort of prosecuted, if there's malpractice and gross incompetence, and also if it covers a payout as well. A lot of people, when they actually look into it, they then change their mind when they realize the personal risk that is involved in it. Also, when you join, what are the board level documents detailing the code of conduct, the protocol, succession planning, annual reviews, organizational strategies, values, and so forth. So, all of that. And you'll get a real feel of the organization, because if they're like, oh yeah, here's all of the packed information, or it's like, actually, we don't have any of that, but can you create that when you join? So it gives you a feel of how well organized, how well structured they are. And, and do they invite you on a true board position, or is it really, can you do a bit of operational work, which is not quite right, really. Generally what happens when you're on the board, typically quarterly, so every 3 months, typically 3 hours, is the norm. And you often get the board papers, hopefully a week before, and that takes about a few hours to read. So often you're looking at about, sort of 4 days a year to cover those 4 board meetings. You often have an annual sort of, review. So that's an extra day. So that's 5 days. And if you sit on subcommittees, you've got a subcommittee for governance, you've got subcommittee for comms, subcommittee for partnerships, or whatever. If you sit on there, then that doubles the time. So you could be looking at anything from 5 to 10 days a year on it. The general consensus, how many people? It's really to have less than 12 is ideal, to avoid becoming a talking shop. and also, ideally an odd number so you can make decisions and move ahead and not be sort of gridlocked, and really to be sort of long term in your thinking. So the other thing is, as PR people, some of us don't feel comfortable with numbers. In the past, some people who were non-accounting people, and the company went into sort of dire straits financially, kind of said, "Oh, nothing to do with me. I'm here, in a PR capacity, not my area." And there's been a lot of court cases that have set a precedent that, irrespective whether you do or you do not have a financial background, you will still be held accountable if there's financial issues of malpractice and gross misconduct. So don't go in there thinking this is my lane. I'm not going to, learn about anything else. There's lots of courses that you can do, which is about, finance for non-finance people. So you can't, renege on your responsibilities and just stay in your lane in terms of this is your PR area and you don't understand about how to read a P&L account. You need to stretch yourself and get that done, because that will be part of your personal risk if you do not keep an eye on that, and ensure that whoever is on the board for the financial is competent and diligent. Then I would also I think we're almost done. I wish you all the best. I think it's been a life-changing experience for me being on boards, and I think that PR people are absolutely suited to it, because we've got all the skill sets: risk analysis, reputation, crisis. We're completely aligned to being boards. So I wish you all the best. Hello. Now, I think we've got a few questions.
Yeah. We've got a couple of questions. Thank you so much, Farzana. That was really fascinating. I know nothing about this area, so I feel very enlightened now. I have one question actually, which is it's a basic question. But so where my background is more sort of charity and non-profit, and so I'm more familiar with there being boards of trustees. Is that the same thing as a NED, or is it
Yes.
different?
Yeah. So NED is like an umbrella term, and under the umbrella you've got the trustees, which is charity, governors, school, and then you've obviously got the commercial sort of NEDs. You've got the nominee NEDs, the investing NEDs, who often are placed there by private equity. So sort of NEDs is very much an umbrella term, and often when you are a trustee, you often have to be a company director. If it's registered with a company's house, that brings on its own different responsibilities, and you've got to ensure that you're legally liable to make sure that the annual accounts are submitted true and fair. You've got to sign them off. You've got to ensure that company's house is updated on any changes in shareholder portfolio. So it definitely is a huge responsibility that I wasn't aware of when I first joined, and over time, when I realized how much responsibility, it dawned upon me actually that you have to be super diligent to protect yourself as well as the organization and its stakeholders.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. So we have a question from Ed Thomas. He's saying, if you or your organization is on the lookout for great NEDs, where should you go to advertise or recruit?
I think that's a really good question. So Ed, what I would advise is obviously, first of all, have a sort of a job description about the position, and be really clear in terms of what the time commitments are, what the skills, experience, just like you're looking for an executive position. You can find examples of that on a platform called Nurole, Nurole, and so have a look at the sort of how these organizations sort of format the requirements, and have it really super clear. And then what I would do is, you could use platforms like Nurole, or there's other organizations that specialize in looking for NED roles. And what you can do is obviously put it out on your social media, put it in your newsletters, send it out to stakeholders, and really try and get that diverse pipeline coming in, because that's so, and that's what's a little bit difficult when you send it out to your network. You're already kind of limiting the kind of people that you're going to get in, and that's why I really think about who do you know in your network that has got access to a diverse network, and really think about it in order to sort of seed that opportunity. And I would and and I think that would be really important, to be conscious and intentional about wanting a diverse pipeline. And that means not just putting it out on social newsletter and calling up your mates, also looking at what organizations are out there that look for NED roles, and what message boards are out there that also champion diversity. And diversity, again, is not just women and ethnicity. Young people are discriminated against on boards because they think, oh, what do they know? They've only been around, for X amount of years in the workplace. That's a really foolish way to look at it. As well as, people with dyslexia, dyspraxia, they bring in such fascinating insight onto boards because they just have a different lens. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, definitely. That cognitive diversity, I think, is such an important piece, isn't it? That was so good. Thank you so much, Farzana. Really fascinating session. And coming up next, we have Leslie Woods. And I've just been reading through the session information, and she talks about Tom Cruise and James Bond. And yeah, sounds like a really exciting session. So definitely come along to that one and share your commsHRO pictures and posts on socials to be in with a chance to win the prize draw at the end of today using the hashtag commsHRO. So we'll see you again at 11 o'clock for the next session, but let's give it up for Farzana. Thank you so much, and
Thank
we'll
you.
see you soon.